For nearly 5 years, Marguerite Annie Johnson, who would one day command stages, presidential inaugurations, and the hearts of millions as Maya Angelou, refused to speak. Not a word. Not a whisper. She was 8 years old when silence became her prison, convinced that the last time she had spoken a man's name aloud, he had died 4 days later. If her voice possessed such deadly power, she reasoned with a child's devastating logic, then the safest thing she could do for everyone she loved was to keep that voice locked away forever. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know in 1936 as she retreated into muteness in Stamps, Arkansas, was that this silence would not destroy her. It would forge her. Those wordless years would become the crucible in which one of the most powerful voices in American literature would be tempered, refined, and ultimately unleashed upon a world that desperately needed to hear what she had to say. This is the story of a Black woman who transformed every attempt to diminish her into evidence of her magnificence. A woman who survived rape, racism, poverty, and silence to become a poet laureate for her people. A woman who proved that the caged bird song is not a cry of defeat, but a declaration of war against every force that seeks to keep us from flying. She entered the world on April 4, 1928, in St. Louis, Missouri, into a family already fracturing. Her parents, Bailey Johnson, a doorman and Navy dietitian, and Vivian Baxter Johnson, a beautiful and volatile woman who worked as a nurse and card dealer, had what would later be described as a calamitous marriage. Marguerite arrived into a home filled with tension that would soon explode into permanent separation. By the time she was 3 years old, that explosion had come. Her parents' marriage dissolved, and her father made a decision that would haunt his daughter for years to come. He placed 3-year-old Marguerite and her 4-year-old brother Bailey Jr. on a train. Alone, 2 Black children, so young they could barely understand what was happening, were tagged like packages and sent nearly 1,000 miles south to Stamps, Arkansas, to live with their paternal grandmother. The image is almost unbearable to contemplate. A toddler and her barely older brother, traveling through Jim Crow America without their parents, carrying whatever they could hold, heading toward a tiny segregated town that would become their home. Years later, Maya would describe this abandonment as one of the defining wounds of her childhood. The question that haunted her was simple and devastating. Why didn't they want us? But in Stamps, they found Annie Henderson, Mama, a woman of such dignity, strength, and business acumen that she had managed to build and maintain the only Black-owned store in town during the depths of the Great Depression. The William Johnson General Merchandise Store stood as a monument to her grandmother's wisdom and resilience. While white businesses crumbled and closed, Mama Henderson's store not only survived but thrived. She accepted rations for goods, made honest deals, and through sheer determination and intelligence provided for her family. Mama Henderson was not demonstratively affectionate. No hugs, no verbal expressions of love, just strict Christian discipline and expectations so high they seemed to pierce the clouds. But her actions spoke what her words wouldn't. She fed them, she clothed them, she gave them work at the store that taught them mathematics and responsibility. Most importantly, she modeled for young Marguerite what a Black woman could be in a world designed to break Black women, unshakable, dignified, and impossible to diminish. The store became Marguerite's classroom. She learned to weigh flour, make change, read labels, and observe human nature. She watched her grandmother interact with white and Black customers, noting how Mama never lowered herself, never groveled, but also never gave white people a reason to enact violence. It was a delicate dance of survival and dignity that every Black person in the South had to master. But if the store taught her commerce and dignity, Stamps itself taught her about the brutal realities of being Black in the Jim Crow South. She learned about lynchings, not just as distant horrors, but as real threats that could materialize any night. Once, a former sheriff warned Mama to hide her disabled son Willie because white men were planning revenge after a black man had allegedly messed with a white woman. Marguerite watched her family hide Uncle Willie in the vegetable bin under potatoes. Understanding that his dark skin made him guilty in white eyes regardless of what he had or hadn't done. She learned about casual dehumanization when young white girls came to the store to mock Mama, mimicking her voice and movements while Mama stood still and dignified, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She learned about systemic racism when Mama took her to see a white dentist, a man who owed Mama money from a loan she'd made him during the Depression. He refused to treat the child's cavities, saying he'd rather put his hand in a dog's mouth than in a black child's mouth. They had to travel all the way to Texarkana to find a black dentist who would help her. Young Marguerite absorbed these lessons, storing them in a mind that was already voracious for knowledge. She excelled at the Lafayette County Training School, often finishing her work before her classmates. She read everything she could get her hands on, and she spent long hours alone at Lake June where she began to think thoughts that felt like poetry, though she didn't yet have the words to name what was stirring in her soul. But then, when she was 7 years old, her father appeared without warning and took her and Bailey back to St. Louis to live with their mother. If Marguerite thought this was the reunion that would heal the wound of abandonment, she was tragically mistaken. What awaited her in St. Louis would nearly destroy her. Vivian Baxter Johnson was stunning, a woman so beautiful that her daughter felt like a shadow in her presence. She had light skin, refined features, and a confidence that commanded attention. She also had a boyfriend named Mr. Freeman, and for a while, the family lived in a complex arrangement with Vivian's mother and uncles. For young Marguerite, starved for maternal affection, any attention felt precious. So when Mr. Freeman began to show her what seemed like fatherly interest, holding her, talking to her, making her feel special, she soaked it up like desert soil absorbing rain. She had no way of knowing that predators often disguise themselves as saviors. The first time Mr. Freeman molested her, 8-year-old Marguerite didn't fully understand what had happened. She knew it felt wrong, strange, confusing. When he told her that if she ever told anyone, he would kill her brother Bailey, the one person in the world she loved most, she believed him absolutely. The threat was precise and perfectly calibrated to ensure her silence. Then came the rape. Mr. Freeman violated this child with such violence that she bled. Terrified and in pain, Marguerite hid her stained underwear under the mattress, trying to conceal the evidence of what had been done to her. But when Bailey and Vivian changed the linens, they found the garment. The truth emerged like a wound, being clean, necessary, but agonizing. The trial that followed was a surreal nightmare. 8-year-old Marguerite was forced to testify in front of a courtroom full of adults, to speak aloud about things no child should know about. The defense attorney asked her if Mr. Freeman had ever touched her before the rape. Terrified, confused, wanting this ordeal to end, she lied. She said no. Mr. Freeman was found guilty, but served only 1 day in jail. 1 day. For raping a child. 4 days after his release, he was found beaten to death. Marguerite's uncles had almost certainly delivered the justice the legal system wouldn't. And this is when the silence began. In her child's mind, Marguerite constructed a devastating logic. She had spoken his name in court. 4 days later, he was dead. Therefore, her voice had killed him. If her voice possessed such lethal power, then speaking was murder. Every word she uttered was a potential weapon that might kill someone she loved. So she stopped speaking completely, to everyone except Bailey, the brother she trusted more than anyone in the world. Shortly after Mr. Freeman's murder, when Marguerite was 8 and Bailey was 9, they were sent back to Stamps. The message seemed clear to Marguerite. She had brought shame and violence to her mother's house, and now she was being expelled again. The rejection compounded the trauma, and her silence deepened. For nearly 5 years, Marguerite Johnson functioned in the world without speaking. Teachers thought she was intellectually disabled. Some people openly called her an idiot or a moron. But Mama, with the wisdom that comes from truly seeing someone, told her granddaughter, "Sister, Mama don't care what these people say, that you must be an idiot, a moron, 'cause you can't talk. You're going to be a teacher." During those silent years, something remarkable happened. Marguerite's other senses and capacities expanded to fill the space where speech had been. She developed an extraordinary memory, able to recall conversations, passages from books, and observations with photographic precision. She became an obsessive reader, devouring everything she could find. She learned to listen, not just to words, but to the rhythms, melodies, and meanings underneath them. She observed human behavior with the attention of a scientist studying a new species. The silence that was meant to protect others was actually protecting something else. A voice that was gathering strength, depth, and power in the darkness, like a butterfly forming inside a cocoon. She was called the aristocrat of black stamps, and Marguerite thought she was the most beautiful woman she had ever seen. Mrs. Bertha Flowers wore printed voile dresses and flowered hats with a grace that made even Arkansas summer heat seem elegant. Her skin was a rich black that would have peeled like a plum if snagged, and she carried herself with such self-possession that she seemed to exist in a reality more refined than the one everyone else occupied. More importantly, Mrs. Bertha Flowers saw something in the silent, traumatized child that others had missed. She saw potential. She saw intelligence. She saw a girl who desperately needed someone to believe she was more than her silence suggested. About a year after Marguerite returned to stamps, Mrs. Flowers began to intervene. She invited the girl to her home, an honor that felt almost sacred. She served her cold lemonade and homemade tea cookies. And then she did something that would change Marguerite's life forever. She read aloud. Mrs. Flowers opened Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities and read. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. For the first time in her life, Marguerite heard poetry. Not just words, but the music words could make, when spoken with intention and love. She was mesmerized. Then Mrs. Flowers explained something crucial. Words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with the shades of deeper meaning. She told Marguerite, "You do not love poetry, not until you speak it." This was the turning point. Mrs. Flowers didn't demand that Marguerite speak. She didn't shame her silence. Instead, she made speaking so appealing, so beautiful, so connected to literature and learning things Marguerite loved, that the girl began to want her voice back. Mrs. Flowers gave her books by Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, and Black writers like Francis Harper, Jessie Fawcett, Georgia Douglas Johnson, and James Weldon Johnson. She told Marguerite to read them aloud when she was alone. She taught her the difference between ignorance and illiteracy. She treated this silent black girl like someone who mattered, someone worthy of time, attention, and cultivation. "I was liked," Maya would later write, and what a difference it made. "I was respected not as Mrs. Henderson's grandchild or Bailey's sister, but for just being Marguerite Johnson." At age 13, Marguerite began to speak again, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. By reading poetry aloud, by hearing her voice transform words into music, she reclaimed what trauma had stolen. Mrs. Bertha Flowers had thrown her that first lifeline, and Marguerite had grabbed hold and begun pulling herself back toward life. When Marguerite was 14, she and Bailey moved again, this time to Oakland, California, to live with their mother, who now had a new partner named Daddy Clydell. Unlike her mother's previous boyfriend, Clydell was kind, genuine, and treated the children with real affection. For the first time, Marguerite had something resembling a stable home. California during World War II was a revelation. She enrolled at George Washington High School and the California Labor School, where she took lessons in dance and drama on scholarship. She was one of only 3 black students at her school, a minority within a minority. But California's racism, while present, felt less suffocating than the Jim Crow South. Then, One day, 15-year-old Marguerite saw something that captivated her imagination: women streetcar conductors. She watched them navigate the hills of San Francisco in their dark blue uniforms, their money changers jangling at their belts, and she wanted that job with a fierce certainty that surprised her. There was just one problem: they didn't hire black girls. When Marguerite went to apply, the secretary turned her away. The discrimination was casual, automatic, not even disguised. Most people would have accepted this rejection and moved on. But Marguerite had learned something crucial in her short, difficult life. She was not most people. She went back the next day, and the next, and the next. For 2 to 3 weeks, this teenage girl showed up at the Market Street Railway Company office, sat down, and refused to leave. She brought books by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky to read while she waited. She ate at nice restaurants during lunch breaks. She treated the discrimination as nothing more than a bureaucratic obstacle to be worn down through persistence. Finally, exhausted by her determination, a supervisor came out and asked why she wanted to be a conductorette. She told the truth. She loved the uniforms and she loved people. Then she lied. She claimed she was 18 years old. They gave her an application. They subjected her to blood tests, aptitude tests, physical coordination tests, and Rorschachs. And then, on what Maya would later call a blissful day, she was hired as the first black female streetcar conductor in San Francisco. The achievement was monumental. This 15-year-old girl, lying about her age, had integrated an entire occupation through sheer force of will. And on her first day, her mother Vivian, who had encouraged her to keep going back, to never accept no as a final answer, followed the streetcar in the family car for the entire route, making sure her daughter was safe. Marguerite worked that job for 5 months, collecting fares on the back platform of electric streetcars, shimmying up and down the sheer hills of San Francisco. Some of her former white classmates, now working as secretaries at the company, whispered racial slurs and mocked her. She endured it with the dignity Mama had modeled in stamps, refusing to let their hatred diminish what she had accomplished. When she finally left the job to return to school, her mother asked what she had learned. Marguerite replied, "I learned I am not afraid to work, and that's about all." But Vivian, with the insight that comes from knowing your child's true nature, corrected her. "No, you learned that you have power and determination. I love you and I am proud of you. With those 2 things you can go anywhere and everywhere." At 16, Marguerite made a decision born from confusion and fear. She had read The Well of Loneliness, a novel about lesbianism, and misunderstood what she had read. Terrified that she might be a lesbian and not understanding what that even meant, she decided to prove she wasn't by having sex with a boy from her neighborhood. The encounter was unpleasant and meaningless. It was also fertile. She got pregnant. Following her brother Bailey's advice, she hid the pregnancy from everyone for 8 months. She continued going to school, determined to graduate. In a testament to both her willpower and her changing body's cooperation, she managed to conceal the pregnancy until she could no longer hide it. 3 weeks after graduating from George Washington High School at age 17, Marguerite gave birth to a son. She named him Clyde Johnson, though she would later call him Guy. When she told her mother and Daddy Clydel about the baby, they were fully supportive. Vivian looked at her daughter holding her newborn son and said, "She will be a good mother." It was both a benediction and a prophecy. Marguerite, who had been abandoned by her own parents, who had been raped and silenced and rejected, who was still essentially a child herself, would spend the rest of her life proving that she could give her son the love and stability she had never received. The first volume of her autobiography, the book that would later make her famous, ends with this image: a young black woman, barely more than a child, holding her baby son and realizing that she is now responsible for another human life. It's an ending that is simultaneously terrifying and hopeful, weighted with uncertainty, but also with possibility. Marguerite didn't know it yet, but this baby, This son, born to a teenage mother with no father present, would become one of the anchors of her life. Everything she would do, everywhere she would go, every risk she would take, would be filtered through the question, what kind of world am I creating for Guy? What kind of woman do I need to become for him? The caged bird was learning that sometimes freedom means accepting the weight of new responsibilities, new loves, new reasons to rise. The years after Guy's birth were a whirlwind of survival, experimentation, and gradually expanding possibility. Marguerite moved through life like someone trying on different identities, searching for the one that would fit the magnitude of what she was becoming. She worked odd jobs, cook, waitress, madam at a brothel, prostitute, a truth she would later reveal in her second autobiography, Gather. Together in My Name, shocking readers who had seen only her dignified public persona. She lived in poverty and danger, making choices that could have destroyed her, but instead taught her about the depths of human desperation and resilience. Then, in the early 1950s, she discovered dance. She studied with Trinidadian dancer Pearl Primus, whose focus on African dance opened new worlds of expression. She formed a dance partnership with a young man named Alvin Ailey, who would go on to become one of the most important choreographers in American history, calling themselves Al and Rita and performing modern and African dance at California venues. But it was calypso that truly captured her imagination. In 1954, when she began performing calypso at the Purple Onion nightclub in San Francisco, her managers suggested she adopt a more distinctive stage name. She combined her childhood nickname Maya with a variation of her ex-husband's surname, creating Maya Angelou, a name that sounded exotic and musical, perfectly suited for a calypso performer. The name stuck because it fit. Marguerite Johnson had been a wounded girl from Stamps, Arkansas. Maya Angelou was a performer, a presence, a woman who commanded stages and captured audiences. The name was both a mask and a revelation, a way of simultaneously hiding and declaring who she truly was. By 1956, she was headlining her own show at the Keyboard in Beverly Hills. She signed with Liberty Records and released an album called Miss Calypso in 1957, featuring 14 tracks, 5 of which she composed herself. She appeared in the film Calypso Heatwave, singing and performing her own compositions. She was building something, not just a career, but a persona, a way of moving through the world that announced she would not be diminished, marginalized, or forgotten. Then came the role that would change everything, the European tour of Porgy and Bess in 1954, 1955. Maya joined the cast of this groundbreaking opera for a 22-nation tour sponsored by the U.S. State Department. It was part of Cold War cultural diplomacy, showcasing Black American artistry to counter Soviet propaganda about American racism. The irony of representing a country that systematically oppressed her people was not lost on Maya, but she took the opportunity anyway. The tour performed at La Scala in Milan, at the Cairo Opera House in Egypt, at the Habima Theater in Tel Aviv. For the first time in her life, Maya saw how the world looked from beyond America's borders. She learned languages, developing a practice of learning the language of every country she visited, eventually gaining proficiency in Spanish, Italian, French, Arabic, and Fanti. She began to understand herself not just as a Black American woman, but as part of a global African diaspora. But the tour meant leaving Guy behind, and Maya vowed she would never again leave her son for extended travel. She had been abandoned too many times to inflict that pain on him. In 1959, Maya moved to New York City at the urging of novelist John Oliver Killens. She joined the Harlem Writers Guild, a prestigious forum for African American writers that included James Baldwin, Paul Marshall, Rosa Guy, and others who would shape Black literature for generations. It was there that she began to see herself as a writer, not just a performer, but someone with something important to say on the page. The Guild's weekly meetings were intense, sometimes brutal in their honesty. Members critiqued each other's work without mercy, pushing each other toward excellence. For Maya, who had always been a voracious reader, this community gave her permission to believe she could be a creator, not just a consumer of literature. Then, in early 1960, she heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak in Harlem. His words moved her so profoundly that she immediately resolved to help the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Along with comedian Godfrey Cambridge, she created and performed in Cabaret for Freedom, a fundraising musical revue. The show ran for 5 weeks and was a rousing success. Dr. King was so impressed that he asked Maya to become the SCLC's Northern Coordinator, succeeding Bayard Rustin. For approximately 6 months in 1960-1961, Maya coordinated SCLC activities in northern states, hosted international visitors, organized fundraising ventures, and worked as part of King's inner circle. Meeting Dr. King was revelatory. She was struck by how small he was, shorter than she expected, and by his youth and easy friendliness. He reminded her of her beloved brother Bailey, small, beautiful speaking voice, radiating quiet strength. She became close friends with Coretta Scott King, a friendship that would last until Coretta's death in 2006. But Maya's involvement with the civil rights movement complicated when she fell in love. In late 1960, at a Harlem Writers Guild party, she met Vusumuzi Make, a South African freedom fighter and civil rights activist. The attraction was immediate and intense. They married in January 1961, and Maya officially resigned from her position with SCLC to follow Make. First, they moved to Cairo, where Make worked for the African Association, a network of anti-colonial activists. Maya, who had no journalism experience, somehow talked her way into a position as associate editor at the Arab Observer, a weekly English-language news magazine. She was the only woman editor in an office of men. For 2 weeks, she locked herself in a room with hundreds of books about journalism, writing, Africa, publishing, and editing, teaching herself what she needed to know. At the Arab Observer, she learned to write propaganda with such subtlety that the reader would think the opinion his own. Her work was radical and anti-colonial, arguing for real militancy in the struggle against apartheid and imperial rule. She also wrote for Radio Cairo, receiving extra pay for every script she read on air. But Egypt presented challenges beyond professional ones. She found herself a stranger in a strange land, her ignorance of Arabic and Islamic traditions putting her at the mercy of a male-dominated society. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, anti-American hostility in the office made her position untenable, and Make's infidelity and financial problems, bills not being paid, debts mounting, eventually destroyed their relationship. When the relationship ended in 1962, Maya made a decision that would prove transformative. She moved to Ghana with Guy, planning to enroll him at the University of Ghana. 3 days after they arrived, Guy was in a serious car accident. He broke his neck. The injury was life-threatening, requiring months of difficult recovery. Maya, who had planned to stay briefly, remained in Ghana throughout his recovery and then for 3 more years unable to leave her son when he needed her most. Ghana became her home. She took a position as administrator at the University of Ghana School of Music and Drama. She worked as feature editor for the African Review, wrote for the Ghanaian Times, and broadcast for Radio Ghana. She became fluent in Fanti and deepened her connections to Africa and the African diaspora. Most importantly, she became part of a small, tight-knit community of African American expatriates living in Accra. W.E.B. Du Bois, Julian Mayfield, Polly Murray, William Gardner Smith, and others who had come to Africa seeking a home free from American racism. They gathered, debated, created, and dreamed of a world where Black people could be fully human, fully free. And then Malcolm X came to visit. Malcolm X arrived in Ghana in May 1964, not long after leaving the Nation of Islam to build his Organization of Afro-American Unity. Maya was among the African American expatriates who formed a Malcolm X committee to guide him through appearances and social events. She hosted him at her mother's house in Ghana, where Vivian bought 6 chickens and fried them so well that Maya was almost sorry to meet Malcolm X because the chicken was so good and I had to share it with him. The memory would make her smile even decades later, that mixture of reverence and humor, the profound and the domestic intertwined. Malcolm X captivated her. His oratory skill combined the imagery of Black American Baptist preachers and the logic of university intellectuals. His mission, to find an African government that would take the UN Genocide Convention and charge the United States with genocide against its Black citizens, was audacious and necessary. His incredible sense of humor surprised her. His thoughtfulness impressed her deeply. He would actually think about her questions and come back with phenomenal answers. They developed what Maya called a brother-sister relationship. When Malcolm X asked her to return to the United States to help him build the OAAU, she agreed. He was creating something important, and she wanted to be part of it. She returned to the United States on February 19, 1965. Ready to work? On February 21, 1965, just 2 days after her return, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan. He was shot multiple times while preparing to address the OAAU. He was 39 years old. Maya was devastated. The OAAU collapsed in the wake of his death. Once again, violence had stolen someone she loved, and once again, she was left to find meaning in the aftermath. She joined her brother in Hawaii, then moved to Los Angeles, working as a market researcher while trying to figure out what to do next. In the summer of 1965, she witnessed the Watts riots, an eruption of rage and despair that felt like an inevitable response to decades of oppression. She moved back to New York in 1967, renewed her friendship with James Baldwin, and began to focus seriously on her writing career. She acted in and wrote plays, searching for the medium that would allow her to say what she needed to say. And then, on April 4, 1968, her 40th birthday, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. He had recently asked her to organize a march for his upcoming Poor People's Campaign. She had postponed planning it so she could focus on her birthday party. And now he was dead, killed on the very day she had chosen to celebrate her own life. The guilt was crushing. For many years afterward, Maya refused to celebrate her birthday. Instead, she sent flowers to Coretta Scott King every April 4th, a ritual of remembrance and apology that she maintained for more than 30 years. James Baldwin, who understood grief and guilt as well as anyone, helped pull her out of her depression. He brought her to a dinner party at the home of cartoonist Jules Feiffer and his wife Judy. The guests began telling childhood stories, and Maya's stories were so compelling that Judy Feiffer called Robert Loomis at Random House the next day and told him he ought to get this woman to write a book. At first, Maya refused. She was a poet and playwright, she said. She was working on a PBS series. She didn't write autobiography, but Loomis, coached by James Baldwin, used a little reverse psychology. He told Maya, "It's just as well, because to write an autobiography as literature is just about impossible." Maya Angelou, who had integrated streetcars at 15 and taught herself journalism in Cairo and survived every attempt to break her, could not resist that challenge. Maya locked herself away in London and began to write. She developed a ritual that she would follow for the rest of her writing life. She would get up at 5 a.m. and check into a hotel room. She instructed the staff to remove all pictures from the walls. She wrote on yellow legal pads while lying on the bed with only a bottle of sherry, a deck of cards for playing solitaire, Roget's, Thesaurus, and the Bible for company. She would write from early morning until early afternoon, averaging 10 to 12 pages per day. In the evening, she would edit those pages down to 3 or 4 that met her standards. The writing was excruciating. While I was writing the book, she later said, "I stayed half drunk in the afternoon and cried all night." She was reliving the trauma, the rape, the muteness, the abandonment, the racism. She was placing herself back in the time she wrote about to tell the human truth about her life. It took her 2 years to write the book. That would become I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The title came from Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, Sympathy, suggested by jazz vocalist and civil rights activist Abbey Lincoln. When it was published in 1969 by Random House, it was immediately clear that Maya had created something unprecedented. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was not just an autobiography. It was a work of literature that combined the narrative techniques of fiction with the testimonial power of autobiography. It covered her life from age 3 to 17, ending with the birth of Guy. More importantly, it broke ground by speaking openly about subjects that were taboo, particularly child sexual abuse. Maya refused to let shame silence her. She wanted rape victims to gain understanding, to forgive themselves, to know it wasn't their fault. If her voice could do that, if speaking could save someone else from the silence that had nearly destroyed her, then it was worth any criticism, any controversy. The book became an immediate national bestseller. James Baldwin praised it, saying, "I know why the caged bird sings, liberates the reader into life simply because Maya, Angelou confronts her own life with such a moving wonder, such a luminous dignity. Her portrait is a biblical study in life in the midst of death." It was nominated for a National Book Award in 1970. It remained on the New York Times paperback bestseller list for 2 years. It sold more than 1 million copies and was translated into more than 17 languages. It made literary history as the first nonfiction bestseller by a Black woman. Maya Angelou, at 41 years old, had finally found her true voice, not as a performer, not as an activist, but as a writer. And that voice would not be silenced again. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings opened a floodgate. Over the next several decades, Maya would write 6 more autobiographies, each one exploring different periods of her life. Gathered Together in My Name, 1974. Singing and Swinging and Gettin' Merry Like Christmas, 1976. The Heart of a Woman, 1981. All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, 1986. A Song Flung Up to Heaven, 2002. And finally, Mom and Me and Mom, 2013, published when she was 85 years old. But it was her poetry that truly made her the voice of her people. In 1971, she published Just Give Me a Cool Drink of Water for I Die, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Then came And Still I Rise in 1978, a collection that included 2 poems that would become anthems for Black women everywhere. Phenomenal Woman and Still I Rise. Phenomenal Woman celebrated Black women's bodies in a way that defied every Eurocentric beauty standard. It didn't apologize for curves, for dark skin, for features that didn't fit white ideals. Instead, it proclaimed with absolute confidence, "I'm a woman/phenomenally. Phenomenal woman, that's me." Still I Rise became even more iconic. It was a defiant response to racism, sexism, and every attempt to diminish Black people. Its refrain, Still I Rise, became a declaration of indestructibility, a promise that no matter what oppression tried to do, Black people would survive and thrive. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. The poem was used in the 1994 advertising campaign for the 50th anniversary of the United Negro College Fund. It appeared in films, it was quoted by activists and politicians. It became the poem Black women recited to themselves when the world tried to make them small. In 1981, Maya accepted a lifetime Reynolds Professorship of American Studies at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The first person to hold this position, she taught philosophy, ethics, theology, science, theater, and writing. She considered herself a teacher who writes, and Wake Forest became her home base for the rest of her life. She received more than 50 honorary degrees from colleges and universities worldwide. She preferred to be called Dr. Angelou, a title she had earned not through traditional academic channels but through the far more difficult path of lived experience and self-education. On January 20th, 1993, Maya Angelou stood before millions of people, in person and watching on television around the world, and read a poem at President Bill Clinton's inauguration. She was the second poet in history to read at a presidential inauguration, after Robert Frost at JFK's 1961 inauguration. The first African American and the first woman to receive this honor. Clinton had chosen her partly because they shared Arkansas roots, but more importantly because he understood that she could bring people together. Her presence on that platform was a statement about whose voices mattered in America, whose stories were part of the national narrative. The poem Maya wrote for the occasion, On the Pulse of Morning, addressed America directly. It spoke of history's pain and possibility, of dinosaurs and dreams, of the need to face each day with courage and hope. Lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. The impact was immediate and profound. The week after her recitation, sales of her books rose 300 to 600%. Random House had to reprint 400,000 copies of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings to meet demand. The company sold more of her books in January 1993 than in all of 1992, a 1,200% increase. Maya won the 1994 Grammy Award for Best Spoken Word for her recitation. But more importantly, that moment on television, a tall, dignified Black woman with a powerful voice proclaiming a vision of American possibility, shifted something in the culture. She had broadened her appeal across racial, economic, and educational boundaries. Young Black girls watching that inauguration saw themselves represented on one of the most important stages in American democracy. Maya had become what Michelle Obama would later describe. A woman who spoke to the essence of Black women. She celebrated Black women's beauty like no one had ever dared to before. Maya lived long enough to see her impact multiply across generations. She continued to write, to teach, to perform on the lecture circuit, making approximately 80 appearances per year, even into her 80s. She hosted legendary gatherings at her home in Winston-Salem, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas tree decorating parties, New Year's Day celebrations that were the most coveted invitations in town. She was famous not just for her words but for her cooking, from haute cuisine to down-home comfort food. She filled her homes in Winston-Salem and in a lordly brownstone she purchased in Harlem in 2004 with books, artwork, and evidence of a life fully lived. In 2010, President Barack Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Obama called her one of the brightest lights of our time, a brilliant writer, a fierce friend, and a truly phenomenal woman. He mentioned that his sister Maya had been named after her. But perhaps the greatest gift of her longevity was the mentorship she provided to younger generations of Black women. Oprah Winfrey called her mentor, mother, sister, friend, and credited Maya with validating her experience as a young Black girl. Michelle Obama said Maya's words carried a little Black girl from the South Side of Chicago all the way to the White House. Countless Black women writers, from Toni Morrison to Hope Wabuck, spoke about how Maya's work gave them permission to tell their own stories, to claim their own voices, to refuse to be silenced or diminished. In 2013, at age 85, Maya published her seventh and final autobiography, Mom and Me and Mom, which focused on her complex relationship with her mother Vivian. Even in her final years, she was still excavating truth, still seeking understanding, still teaching through her life's example. By 2014, Maya's health was declining. She had heart ailments, respiratory failure, and constant pain from her years as a dancer. She canceled scheduled appearances, but she was still working on another book about her experiences with national and world leaders, still teaching, still creating. On the morning of May 28, 2014, before 8 a.m., Maya Angelou died quietly at her home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She was 86 years old. Her family released a statement. She lived a life as a teacher, activist, artist, and human being. She was a warrior for equality, tolerance, and peace. The outpouring of grief and celebration was immediate and global. President Obama, President Clinton, and First Lady Michelle Obama released statements. Tributes came from world leaders, artists, writers, and millions of ordinary people whose lives she had touched. Memorial services were held at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Winston-Salem and at Wake Forest University's Waite Chapel. Oprah Winfrey, Michelle Obama, and Bill Clinton spoke about her impact. Her son Guy Johnson said that despite her pain and declining health, she left this mortal plane with no loss of acuity and no loss in comprehension. The week after her death, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings rose to #1 on Amazon's bestseller list. 45 years after its publication, people were still discovering or returning to the book that had changed American literature. In 2022, 8 years after her death, Maya became the first Black woman depicted on a U.S. quarter, part of the American Women Quarters series. The coin shows her with outstretched arms, with a bird in flight and a rising sun behind her on image that captures the essence of her life and message. What Maya Angelou accomplished in her 86 years defies easy summary. She was the first Black female streetcar conductor in San Francisco. She was a calypso dancer, a singer, and an actress. She lived in Egypt and Ghana. She worked with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. She wrote the first nonfiction bestseller by a Black woman. She became one of America's most celebrated poets. She read at a presidential inauguration. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but the list of accomplishments, impressive as it is, doesn't capture the essence of her legacy. Maya's true gift was showing Black women, showing all people who have been silenced, marginalized, or oppressed, that survival is not enough. We must survive with grace and faith. We must transform our pain into power, our silence into song, our defeats into determination. She proved that a raped child who stops speaking can become one of the most powerful voices in American literature. She proved that a girl abandoned by her parents can become a mother figure to millions. She proved that surviving trauma doesn't mean forgetting it or being destroyed by it, but rather using it as the foundation for unshakable strength. I can be changed by what happens to me, she said, but I refuse to be reduced by it. Michelle Obama, speaking at Maya's memorial, captured what she meant to Black women. She didn't just want to be phenomenal herself. She wanted us all to be phenomenal right alongside her. For at a time when there were such stifling constraints on how Black women could exist in the world, she serenely disregarded all the rules with fiercely passionate, unapologetic self. Her philosophy was deceptively simple but radically transformative. All my work, my life, everything I do is about survival. Not just bare, awful, plodding survival, but survival with grace and faith. While one may encounter many defeats, one must not be defeated. She lived that philosophy every day of her life. From that train ride at age 3 to her final breath at age 86, Maya Angelou demonstrated that the caged bird song is not a lament but a weapon. It is the sound of someone who refuses to accept the cage as permanent. Who knows that bars and chains and racism and trauma and every attempt to make you small and quiet and defeated will ultimately fail if you just keep singing. Today her books are still bestsellers. Her poems are still quoted, recited, and tattooed on skin and carried in hearts. Her voice, that voice that she once feared could kill, continues to give life, hope, and courage to everyone who hears it. Every time a Black woman steps confidently into a room, knowing she belongs, Maya's spirit is there. Every time a young girl reads Phenomenal Woman and sees herself in those words, Maya's influence lives on. Every time someone who has survived trauma finds the courage to speak their truth, they are following the path Maya cleared. She taught us that we are more alike than unalike, that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. That courage is the most important virtue because without it, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. That people will forget what you said and what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Most importantly, she taught us that we can rise. No matter how many times the world tries to trod us in the dirt, we can rise. Like dust, like air, like the sun itself, inevitable, unstoppable, essential. The caged bird learned to sing, and her song transformed the world. That song continues, carried forward by every person who refuses to be reduced, diminished, or silenced. That song is eternal because it speaks a truth that every oppressed person knows in their bones. We will survive, we will thrive, and we will rise. Still, we rise.